Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 12 Skills Podcast, where we help you become a stronger leader and accelerate your career. I'm your co-host, Laura Downing, CEO of Clear Coaching, and joining me today is my co-host, Ed Barrows. Hey, Ed.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Laura. Hey, Thomas. How are you?
We are here today with our guest interview, Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg. Let me tell you a bit about Thomas before we start peppering him with questions. Thomas is the author of a book called What's Your Problem?, which addresses how you can solve the right problems. He's also a co-author of Innovation as Usual, a Harvard Business Review book on the art of driving innovation inside of regular organizations. Thomas has worked with managers all over the globe: China, India, Russia, his native country, Denmark. His research has been featured in everywhere from Harvard Business Review, The Economist, the BBC. The HR Magazine recognizes him as a top 20 international thinker. I've seen Thomas present a lot of his work to clients, and it's really quite compelling. I've even seen him do this through a fire alarm. So I'll tell you, there is nothing that's going to stop him from delivering that message. And just to wrap up, Thomas has an MA in Media Science from the University of Copenhagen and an MBA from IESE Business School. And prior to his business school, Thomas served 4 years as an officer with the Danish Royal Guards. Oof, that's quite a resume.
Indeed.
All right, Thomas, we're going to jump in, and I'm going to start with one of my favorite Einstein quotes. Einstein said, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem itself and 5 minutes thinking about solutions. What do you think? Did he get it right?
I think I both love and hate that quote. And I think what I love about it is that it captures something really important, namely paying attention to the problem. And that's, as you know, and as we're going to delve into here, that's really my biggest pet peeve when it comes to problem solving. That people don't do it and they don't know how to do it. And as a result, we waste a lot of time, money, energy on solving the wrong problems. What I don't like about the quote, I think it's kind of like, this is maybe a little finicky, but when you look at what it actually says, it doesn't just say pay attention to the problem. It also says that you should spend like 90% of the time you have on just thinking about the problem. And that, I think, would be a disaster. Right. Like in reality, you need to switch back and forth between thinking about the problem and trying stuff, prototyping, conversations, and all of that stuff. So that's the one thing I really don't like about it. It can trap people in this kind of like, endless analysis, which is not, to me, the right way to go.
It's kind of the opposite problem, right? Instead of jumping to the conclusion of what's the problem and diving down the rat hole of a solution, you spend too much time. Okay, all right, well, I'll let Einstein know the next time I see him.
I know. But I guess it's like sometimes a mistake that it depends on personality type. I think like when I work with executives in companies, like those well, they don't tend to fall into the trap of analyzing things too much. Like they are more towards maybe to action too rapidly. On the other hand, when I work with academics or people who have multiple PhD degrees, they can very happily sit in a dark corner for 12 years and think, and maybe not the ideal approach either. So somewhere the happy medium, somewhere in between.
Yeah, Thomas, as an academic, I take offense to that. It's more like 9 years.
He was exaggerating.
It took me 9 years.
Oh, you're one of the new academics, one of the fat ones.
So, yeah, that's a great point. And, I listened to you obviously, Laura and I have had a chance to work with you. I know you do. You have a really wonderful piece on Harvard Business Review's IdeaCast. I know you use some really interesting examples that are, I think, really illustrative if anyone wants to hear another point of view on Thomas's research. I think the question I have is sort of a derivative of what Laura's asking is, how would you approach problem solving as a process? There's quite a bit of literature out there. I know there's another large consulting firm that's put out a book recently on it. I'm sure you've seen it. All of it's good. I think one of the things I find, and Laura, and probably you do as well, is in practice, managers get really excited to solve problems. That's what I do. Bring me your sick and your lame and your unwanted problems, and I, in my infinite wisdom, will solve them. What's wrong with the approach that many leaders take, and then maybe how would you reframe that?
I'd say there's a basic and an advanced trap to fall into. The basic mistake, we kind of touch on that, is just to jump straight into solution mode and say, okay, how do we solve this? And I call it basic. Maybe that's a bit unfair because professional problem solvers can do it too, especially if they're under time pressure. The mistake that I find more interesting is when people know they have to look at the problem, but they don't understand the difference between analysis and framing. And that's really my big thing. Like analysis is when you delve deeper into the problem and really analyze it minutely and understand all of the details of it. Framing, on the other hand, is really asking, wait a second, before we jump into detail on analyzing this and doing a MECE analysis and all of that, is this even the right problem to look at? Should we be looking at this thing in the first place? Should I share the slow elevator thing?
Yeah, I guess I'm familiar with, and I think if you give an illustration, we talk about it a little bit in our book too, but I guess if I'm listening to this for the first time, I'm not familiar with your process, I'd want to know what reframing is. And I guess, shouldn't we just be taking it kind of as a granted when someone brings us a problem that is the problem solved? I guess that's where it might be useful to elaborate.
Yeah, I think the intuition that your listeners here, if they work, for instance, in consulting or similar, they kind of know they have to be a little bit careful about just embracing the problem as stated by the client. The example I love to use, you have an office building, you're the owner of it, and people in the building are complaining about the speed of the elevator. It's too slow. You can jump into action, try to make it faster. That's a basic mistake. Or you can commit the advanced mistake, which is to analyze why the elevator is slow. That's great, but you might be better off thinking about whether the speed of the elevator is really the problem. And, if you ask an experienced landlord, they're going to have a very different suggestion. They know that the speed of the elevator is not the problem. It's probably just the waiting time, the perception of waiting that's really bothering people. And to that end, you can put up a mirror next to the elevator because people see their own reflection, they fall in love, they forget that they're waiting, and so on. So that super simple illustration of the core difference between analyzing a problem, why is the elevator slow, and then asking, wait, is it really the speed of the elevator we should be paying attention to here? Or is there something better for us to focus on?
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Thomas, I just have to tell you, I have a friend who bought a lovely tea kettle in London. She was so happy with her tea kettle, and she, it was just it was a teapot, not a kettle. Yeah. And she brought it home, and she was sad when she got home because she found that the lid didn't fit properly. So she had a business colleague who was going back to London, so she asked the person to buy her a new lid. And so the person happily went over and got her a new lid and brought it back to her in the States, and the lid didn't fit again. Do you know she bought another whole lid before figuring out it was the base that was misshapen?
That's a wonderful story. Exactly.
Right?
It's kind of, I mean, maybe the tea company kind of calculated with that extra income.
They probably charge as much for a lid as they do for the whole set.
Exactly. Quite clever of them. Well, I know, I mean, we see this in business all the time, but I actually know that you have an example of it. So in your book, 12 Skills, you have this wonderful story of a bottling company, I think it is, that with the labels. Can you share that story? I thought it was so good.
Absolutely. This was a beverage company, and they were striving to achieve 99% quality. 99.9% was actually their threshold. So we decided to overlook the fact that 99.9% is not necessarily a reasonable threshold. And so we just went into, well, what are your biggest quality issues? And they said, those neck labels, they sit there and the people complain because they sit there in the bar and they rub them and they're sticky, and then the glue they hate the neck labels, and they're not on straight. They're not on straight. So then they started, as you used your example, they started going down this path of how they were going to make the labels straight and stick better. When in fact, there was one person in the room who sort of sheepishly raised their hand and said, they don't like the neck labels. They don't want neck labels. And everybody sort of turned and looked at them and said, right, but we can straighten them out. I mean, they actually didn't hear it. It was so interesting to see a reframing presented to them. Yeah. And they were already kind of, as you said, analyzing the solution.
Yeah.
And it was amazing to watch.
So one reason I love that example is, I think sometimes on the surface, if you just hear about this and you hear about the mistakes people make, you can think like, oh, they're probably just not very smart people. Like,
right, they're stupid.
Yeah, your friend with the teapot, for instance, don't quite know. No, I don't know her.
They're not friends anymore.
Exactly.
I'll not name either the company nor the friend.
But when I see this everywhere. I see it with super gifted people who are educated up the wazoo, and they are maybe high ranking and so on, and they still commit this mistake. This is not just something that stupid people do. It is something you see everywhere, at every level of the company. With your group there, with a beverage company, I'm pretty sure those engineers were highly trained. They were professional problem solvers. They were great at what they did, and yet this happens. We fall in love with a solution or maybe a problem we think about, and we forget to question whether there's a different way of looking at it.
It's interesting to hear you talk about this, because I had forgotten about the elevator example for a bit. We've been working on so many things, but I realized a couple of weeks ago, I have a tenant in a small apartment I rent, and she was complaining that the dishwasher takes too long and doesn't do a good job. So now I'm just going to put up a mirror and hopefully
this solves everything, in fact. So
that will work.
Well, what do you advise though? What do you do with these organizations? How do you shift their mindset? Because no one has ever asked me to think about a problem, right? They usually have asked me over the years to solve a problem. So how do you shift that mindset to understanding the problem? It seems so fundamental and yet elusive.
Three steps. I teach the method to them, then I train them in it, and then I let them figure out how to integrate it. So teaching is just like the intellectual understanding that we covered here, between like what is framing, why is it important, how is it different from analysis. Training, because it's really a muscle you have to build. It's not enough to know that this is the case. You kind of actually have to start applying it deliberately, ideally with some guidance, until you get it. And after that point, I found it's important to let people figure out how to best fit it into their world, because all companies are different. And sometimes you want to use a different terminology. Sometimes you want to focus it on, let's say, there's this part of the business where it really would have a big impact because our people are all acting like order takers when they're getting requests.
Right.
And that's where we could really make a huge difference if we could teach them this. So there's that final leg, which I can only do part of the work with, where people figure out how to put it to work as an integrated part of their day-to-day work. This is not something you save for the annual strategy seminar. It's ideally something people use on a random Wednesday afternoon.
Are there any tips or questions, or just a couple of things that people might do before they take your training to tip the scales in terms of just, at least, I think one of the things I like that you pointed out is just having the awareness. How do you even help people get over that awareness barrier? And then maybe what are one or two things they could think about in advance?
A really helpful thing is actually to memorize that slow elevator story I just shared. I found what very often happens is you're in a conversation with somebody and you realize you need to maybe think twice about the problem, but you don't really have permission to do it in some sense, or maybe especially if it's a client or a more senior person, whatever, you actually need to create a little bit of conversational space for it. And I found literally sharing that elevator example in the same length that we just shared it here earlier, but 40 seconds, that can be enough to make people understand why you want to ask questions about the problem. One other advice I'd throw in there, which is, it's a basic form of reframing. We touched on it here already. It is to see things from the customer's perspective. That's what happened there in the bottle company. And I think when in the domain of household objects, I remember this beautiful example from, I think it's Bosch. They did this dishwasher.
Yeah.
And the dishwasher had this function, very helpful, where it would beep and keep beeping once it was done. And you know that function where the engineers thought, let's be helpful. Let's tell people that their dishes are done. They'll be excited.
Smoke detectors everywhere were taken off the wall for that problem.
And in fairness, smoke detectors, there's a reason you want them to keep beeping. I think that is a deliberate choice because otherwise people don't exchange them. But the dishwasher, you could tell here, right? You're laughing that it keeps beeping. And this is a function that was actually hard to turn off. You had to go into the settings and deep down to disable this thing. What did the engineers forget? Most people put on the dishwasher before they go to bed. And they're, of course, not very happy at being woken up 45 minutes later by the dishwasher that insists on displaying the proudly washed dishes. So
Yeah.
it happens all the time. And I think this is where I think as well, design thinking methods can help, or just the customer journey focus, those things. That's one helpful way of remembering to see the problem differently.
One thing that you write about, Thomas, that I think is important too, is that you advise people to bring together different people from different disciplines in different areas. Because I think sometimes you could bring in, somebody from outside the room who would say, it's the teapot, not the lid, stupid, right? Just somebody with a totally fresh view who doesn't have those preconceived biases.
Yeah. Biases is the key word, right? Because like the last many years of research in behavioral economics and so on have very clearly demonstrated the presence of bias. The issue is that knowing that is not enough. There's also pretty clear research that, you still commit the mistakes even being aware of the biases. The shortcut, it's not to try to fight your own biases. It is to pull different people in with different biases. Like there's something about, you can almost triangulate a problem by having several, individually flawed people, but together we see things more clearly.
Yeah. And
exactly what you're saying. Sometimes if it's a big problem, you want to pull in people who are very different, completely different backgrounds, and so on. But sometimes it's enough just to pull in a colleague, like just one other person who can a little bit maybe see things differently and say, like, that's not a lid, my friend. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm still confused about this teapot. It didn't actually have a lid?
No, the lid didn't sit properly. It was actually the opening in the teapot that wasn't round. So the lids weren't flawed. She kept buying lids, but it was actually the pot itself that was flawed.
Beautiful. Okay, so now you see. Now I understand it.
I was just gonna say, boy,
now
worked with that example.
Well, exactly.
Well, it's interesting how many of these examples it's probably interesting how many we're aware of or how many we're not aware of. That's probably the part that's even scarier. How many times we've worked on a problem or not even framed the problem to begin with properly. And I think the stories, I find them just really fascinating, Thomas. I'll ask you, in your Harvard Business Review article, I know you talk about in your teaching, it might be good for everyone to hear as we head into the home stretch, the one example you use about people who bring dogs back to the shelter.
Yeah.
We have a lot of dog owners out there these days, and I think a lot of people find a lot of comfort in dogs for good reasons. They're great companions. But I think some of the pieces in your article in Harvard Business Review were really eye-opening for me.
It comes down to the fact that in the U.S., there's about 3 million dogs every year that enter a shelter. And about half of those, through the work of volunteers and so on, they find a new home, which means every year there's more than 1 million extra dogs that, we need more homes for them. And the present efforts with advertising and so on is not enough. It makes a difference. And I'm sure you've seen it in your Facebook feeds. If you ever clicked on one, it will forever be populated by sad-looking dogs. But essentially what happened was that there's this woman, Lori Weiss, based in Los Angeles, who'd been working in the space for a long time. And she wondered a little bit about what was going on, because the industry-wide perception was, because this number of like people handing their dogs to a shelter, that number is high. It's about 30% of their intake. And so they concluded, maybe understandably, that there must be a lot of bad people out there. Like, these people should never have been allowed to have a dog in the first place. How can you show up at a shelter and like hand over your dog like it was some broken consumer good? That didn't quite match Lori's perception of what was going on. She knew a lot of these people, and she started to look into, why do people hand a dog to a shelter? Why does that happen? Is that just because they are sociopaths, or what's happening? Specifically, she put one of her staff members in front of a shelter, and whenever a family came in wanting to hand over a dog or another pet, the staff member would ask, "Why are you here today? Like, why? And why would you prefer to keep your dog if you could?" And 75% of the people she asked said yes to that. It turned out that the problem of dogs being left with shelters isn't really about bad people. It is first and foremost about poverty. It is about the financial straits that these families are in. They have a dog. They have had it for years. They love it like you love it. We love our dogs. And then at some point, they are forced to move into a new building. The landlord of the new building says, you're going to have to pay a $150 deposit to have a dog here. And if you are living in the financial circumstances that an uncomfortably high percentage of Americans are living in, $150, that's not something you can spend on a dog. You might be struggling to feed your kids every night. And so Laurie just realized, having had that insight about what was really going on in this space, that they could use the funds they normally use to help dogs after they got into the shelter. They could use them to, for instance, put down the deposit and help the dogs stay out of there in the first place. And not only did that allow the family to keep their dog, it turned out it was actually also more cost effective. They brought their costs down from typically $85 per dog they helped down to around, I said 85, $85 per dog, down to around $60 per dog. So a massive decrease in their costs for helping an animal, just based on this insight. That to me, it stood out to me as such a powerful story, as such a powerful example of we are not going to get it right unless we truly understand other people's problems and perspectives in when we're dealing with them.
Yeah, I think that story's great, and I love to hear it. I mean, I love the context of the story, and I appreciate how Laurie looked at that differently. And I think many of us maybe have the misconception about why people bring dogs back to shelters. And now that you frame it as a financial issue, or it is a financial issue, you look at it differently. I know you have many, many more stories. The one that you tell about kids and the things that bother them is especially good. I will let people follow up with you directly if they're interested in hearing more, but I can tell you that they just get better from here.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Absolutely. And take a minute to look at what's your problem, and a number of articles written by Thomas as well. So Thomas, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your content, which we've included extensively in our book, 12 Skills. So thank you for that, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, and congratulations with the book. It's amazing.
Thank you.